Okay, thanks everyone for coming. In addition to Yang, we have another co-author, Xin-Feng Zhou, who's at Renmin University, People's University in Beijing. That's where Yang actually got her bachelor's degree, if I remember correctly, or maybe it was master's. Okay, so this paper is kind of a follow-up paper that I wrote with Albert Park and Cho Chung-Fong that was published in the same journal. Oh, I should point out, this was published last year, the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. And we had Albert and Cho Chung and I had a previous paper that was covered, but this one has more recent data, so it's better. I think Albert would agree, it's a better paper than that one. So let me give you some motivation for this. You know, economists have been studying the wages of workers for decades, if not, centuries. And, people like Gary Becker and Jacob Mincer looked at the effect of years of schooling on wages and also years of experience. But now people are starting to look at non-cognitive skills, and Heckman and other people have sort of led the way on this. There's lots of interesting things. We don't really go through it in the paper, but one of the most famous sort of studies of, can we get kids who are disadvantaged to do well? This is Perry preschool program, and they found that if you have a really good preschool, their scores go up, their academic scores go up. But then when they come back like 5 or 8 years later, there's no difference. So that okay, maybe this program really didn't work so well after all. But then when you go back and you look at their outcomes during adulthood, even though the scores are the same, they have better outcomes in terms of employment, reduced, criminal activity, or reduced, pregnancies, unplanned pregnancies, and things like this. So people think maybe it's not just the cognitive skills, but the non-cognitive skills that matter for what happens. So almost all this research is being done in developed countries. I'm looking at non-cognitive skills. There are just a few papers that look at developing countries, okay? Another reason why we're kind of interested in these non-cognitive skills is that it seems like they're more malleable. Like if you look at cognitive skills, in some ways, like things are set by age 10 or 12 or something like this, but non-cognitive skills seem to be more malleable in later ages. So maybe there's more room there for policies to be effective. The other thing we do in this paper, maybe it's on the next slide. Yeah, we look at sort of gender gaps in what is the effect of non-cognitive skills and cognitive skills on wages and on eventual years of schooling. And we see that there are some big differences between men and women. We'll get into that later.
So, Paul, a quick question.
Yeah.
So, is language skill cognitive or non-cognitive?
Language skill? I probably say it's cognitive skill. Non-cognitive skill has a lot to do with sort of behaviors, and sort of psychological traits. And whereas literacy, I would say that's, people generally classify that as cognitive.
So when I came to the US, my cognitive skill declined significantly, right? Because my language skill is not that good grade in English language. Is that true?
Well, I wouldn't say your skills declined. It's just that your environment was very different. So the skills you have. But I'd say that it's not so much your skills change, but the environment changed. And so the interaction of those two kind of has an effect on all kinds of outcomes. Okay.
So I was just gonna follow up on Ben's comment. Actually, I was talking to Michael Frank, who is a linguistic professor, and he actually told me so the language skill is highly correlated with the cognitive skill. Yeah. So
Okay. Yeah. These definitions are a little bit fuzzy. Where to draw the line and things like that. Okay. Well, we can come back to that later. Okay. So there's really not much on these gender differences. There's a few papers here, mostly on the U.S. or Europe or things like this. There's one on Bangladesh and I think another one on Peru. But this is one of the very few that looks at a developing country, looking at these gender differences. Okay. So we use this data from the Gansu Survey of Children's and Family, which is a panel data that's started by Albert Park and Emily Hannum back in the year 2000, and follow these kids for about 15 years. Actually, they're not kids anymore. And I'll talk a little bit more. And so what we do is kind of look at how these cognitive skills that were measured when they were in school, which has some advantages in terms of doing estimation, how they affect their labor market outcomes, especially wages when they're adults. And also the second thing, as I mentioned, we're going to look at gender differences in both, especially with non-cognitive skills. We didn't find a big difference in cognitive skills. Okay, so that kind of sums up what's going on in terms of contribution. We have a nice data set, which we'll talk about in a minute, that allows us to deal with some of the estimation problems. And also this again is for a developing country. And finally, it's one of the rare things to look at gender differences in cognitive and non-cognitive skills. Okay, so here's a little bit about the data. Gansu province is there. It's considered to be northwest, but you might say it's north central or something. It's probably the last province as you're going toward the west that's mostly ethnically Chinese as opposed to Tibetan or Uyghur or whatever else is out there. And it's one of the poorest provinces of China. I think when we looked at the data, it's out of 31 provinces, it was number 30 in terms of poverty. So it's a relatively poor province in China, relatively remote. So we, actually it wasn't me, I didn't get involved in this until the second wave, but Albert and Emily did a survey of 2,000 children in Gansu province, in rural areas of Gansu province. They randomly sampled 20 counties. They're the ones that are in yellow there, and then you can see the names if you're familiar with Gansu. And then I think we were just discussing this a few minutes ago. I think within each county we had 5 villages. So we have 20 counties and 100 villages for the data. And so it was first data were collected 2,000 kids when they're 9 to 12 years old. That was wave 1, and then so we have these additional waves. I got involved in 2004 and following. So we kind of followed this. So in 2000 they're 9 to 12. 2004 they're 13 to 16. 2017 to 2018 they're more like 17 to 21 years old, and that's from the paper I mentioned earlier with Albert and Shoucheng Huang. And then we're going to use well, it's not so new anymore, the data from 2015 to look at the kids when they're in their mid-20s. A lot of the kids at this time period were still in school, so we had a smaller sample, but we'll get to that and we'll compare the previous paper. And so it's a very rich data set, which we'll talk about in a bit. But keep in mind, this is a poor area of China. We're only looking at rural kids. In fact, you'll see that about 1/3 of these kids, or their adults, they've left Gansu province. They've gone to the east or to the south or somewhere else. They're not in Gansu anymore.
And did you find those guys?
Mostly, yeah. I mean, the one thing nice about working in China is that Chinese New Year, most people come home. And so you can kind of catch them there. And also we got their cell phone numbers. So some of the interviews were done on cell phones wherever they were. Okay, so this is all about cognitive and non-cognitive skills. So we're going to focus on the things that were measured in the first 2 waves because the kids weren't working when they were 9 to 12 or 13 to 16. We also test and sort of cognitive and non-cognitive skills in 2009. But by then, maybe 40% were working, and so we think maybe there's some, sort of reverse causality or something there. So we're just going to focus on these things. So cognitive skills, the Chinese and math tests are academic tests. I mean, they're basically the questions had to do with the curriculum that the kids were learning. So they're very academic. This cognitive skills test is something that was developed by some education experts, and it measures some math ability, but also some common knowledge. I was looking in the paper, like one of the questions they asked these kids is, what does the stomach do? Okay, I don't think that's something they learn directly in school. Maybe they do, I don't know. But, and they say like, what's the similarity between your elbow and your knee? And just kind of a general test of skills that are not necessarily academic skills, but we would think of them as cognitive skills, just their knowledge, okay? The literacy test that was used here was based on what's called the International Adult Literacy Survey, which I think the OECD or somebody in Europe has developed. I can't remember exactly how it is. And so again, it's not an academic type test, but it's more a general, like, in everyday life, do you know how to use your reading ability to like find out information and stuff like that. Okay. So we're going to use all of these things. Non-cognitive skills, internalizing, externalizing. I'll explain what they are in the next slide, actually. So let's go to the next slide. Okay. So the cognitive skills, well, yeah, this actually has what I was just telling you here. So let's go to the non-cognitive skills. So the main ones are internalizing and externalizing behavior. Internalizing is sort of being withdrawn and depressed, being sort of anxious and shy, maybe having low self-esteem, just being a quiet person who doesn't really interact so much with other people. Externalizing behavior, you might think that's good compared to what I just said about internalizing, but not really. Externalizing is basically bad behavior, okay? Being destructive, being aggressive, and like this. So to give you an idea of those non-cognitive skills, these are the questions that are asked. Maybe it's hard to read because it's in small font here, but so internalizing behavior, there are things like, I can't concentrate on what I'm doing, I'm teased by my classmates, I feel inferior to others, that kind of attitudes. And externalizing is, misbehaving, I quarrel with others, I often say obscenities, I tell lies, just being kind of bad behavior. And you'll see that it shows up in what happens in these outcomes.
Are these surveys validated with some other data? I mean, because psychologists come up with new surveys all the time,
Right.
and you're not sure how to generalize.
I think so, but I don't remember. Maybe Young can refresh my memory, but I think they have been. I mean, it's true that psychologists come up with new things, and later on, like in the third wave, we did this Rosenberg self-esteem test, which has been around forever, and there's some newer things. So I think they have been, but I'll have to check to be sure. Okay. Yes.
Are you worried about social desirability bias when asking these questions?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, we're testing them on their kids, so maybe they're less clever about, trying to, give you an impression that's not really true or something like that. But that's something that's potentially a problem. Yeah. So I don't think it'll completely, cancel out what they're like, but it could. And then there's one issue is kind of like measurement error. These are going to be noisy. And if you're putting them in the regression, and also the cognitive skills, if they're noisy, you can have, probably attenuation bias that you'll underestimate the effects. Yeah.
Just following up with that question, I was wondering if the survey was done by government officials or government, people from government, are you worried about the data quality?
We actually trained people who were like university students to collect the data.
Just like me.
Yeah, so they weren't really government officials.
You're not worried about that?
They had this good and bad.
They're all about
Yeah. So so they weren't like government officials that
they're usually college
should be
or grad students.
Yeah,
and they're
like
usually
sociology or
very
something.
focused and
Does their cognitive or non-cognitive skills affect the quality of the survey?
Of the kids,
Yeah.
I don't think so. We're not really using very much else that we asked them back then, okay, other than they took these tests and they answered the questionnaire that we did the non-cognitive skills from. And then when they're adults, we asked them about their work and their wages and stuff like that. I suppose, if somebody says, I lie. So one of these things is like, I tell lies a lot. Maybe, I sometimes tell lies, maybe they were lying about their wages. I don't know. That's a problem. Any time you collect data, you can't be 100% sure that it's
so Wong has been doing lots of work on mental health in schools and everything. So are most of these validated or can you tell from this?
I've never seen this scale before, but in psychological scales, there are some questions about, check the validity of their answers. Like, I've never not lied, I've never lied. So these kind of usually is 5 questions that you look at these questions that gives you whether or not the kids are being honest.
So you can check them with something else.
With the scale, but I'm not familiar with this scale.
One thing we do, and I mentioned briefly, is sort of get at the issue of measurement error, is we also ask these kinds of questions of their teachers and their parents. So we use those sometimes as instruments for what the kids say, just to try to deal with attenuation bias and measurement. But we didn't really check them to see whether, I mean, if we assume the teacher is being honest, and the kid maybe is not, to see whether, I mean, that's something we could probably do.
So I'm not sure what measurement error means here. You're just saying that they don't record your real answer?
Well, I'm sort of just saying it's kind of noisy, you know, the way you might answer this question might depend on like how good of a day you had today or something like that.
But the probably more serious measurement error is whether there's some underlying concept that you're trying to measure, and
Yeah.
whether these questions do that, as opposed to just the dog was barking outside and I couldn't concentrate.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of, both of those are possible, you know, but there are these underlying concepts of the psychologists. I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not the best one to explain that we're trying to look at in terms of, I mean, this is basically, externalizing is basically a kind of almost like antisocial people. It's not getting along with other people. And internalizing is more, I just have difficulty doing social, you know, interacting socially with people, and you know, I'm kind of like not very extroverted. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. Thanks for all these questions. Other variables that we look at in this paper, these are the outcome variables actually. The years of schooling, which, you know, now that they're in their 20s in the 2015 wave, we know they're almost all done with their education. And then the wages they were getting in 2015. The labor force participation is pretty high, 93% for men and that 80% for the women. But we still worry about, you know, sort of a selection bias. What about the ones who are not working? And also, you know, so most of them are in the labor force if you average over the men and the women, but we've actually lost about a third of the kids by 2015. So there's another selection bias, which is like, we just couldn't find them, or we couldn't get an interview done, or yeah, something like that. Okay, so I'll get to that later. For most of these people who are in the labor force, they're working for wages. But there's some of them, maybe 20%, 15, 20% are self-employed. So we kind of ask a different set of questions to get an income for them, more of an annual income than like a weekly or hourly income. Okay, so that's kind of it. And I'll come back later to some of those issues about calculating the wages and the selection bias. Okay, so this is just some statistics. We put Skip there since it's not that interesting. But one thing to point out is that these kids, you know, they've got like 11 and a half years of schooling. It's just like in the US, I think 12 years is the end of secondary school. Their parents, though, are much less educated. You know, this is a very poor area of China. So father had 6.5 years, and mother had 4 years of school. Okay. And something we'll come back to later is that about half of them are married and 40% have a child, you know, which affects women's labor force participation quite a bit. Okay.
I mean, look at that, 2,800 hours working average.
Yeah, they work hard. A lot. Yeah.
So what is log wealth per capita in 2000?
Oh, let's see.
The 10 to 8.
Yeah, we have actually, yeah, in the Young, you may be able to help me with the log wealth. If I remember correctly, it was like a principal components based on ownership of durable goods and things like that. Does that
That's the
sound
negative
right?
log of it.
Yeah.
Not 10 to the power 8, right?
Pardon?
That's not 10 to the power 8.
Oh.
That's very big. That's a very big number.
Yeah, I don't know why the log is.
So 10 million.
Yeah. So there actually there's some numbers about the value of those durable goods. I admit this is one detail I don't remember off. So yeah, maybe you could see why is the log actual value in renminbi or whatever, rather than just some index. Okay. Yeah, we'll come back to that. Sorry, you know, after you get this paper published, you go on to the next paper. Yeah, all the details.
I have another question about
Yeah.
the labor force participation.
Yeah.
How did you define that? And what if you know, someone kind of like worked periodically, let's say
Yeah.
earlier? Yeah.
Yeah, this is like working, I think it was within the last month or so. something, working at least one day, within the last month. So that's what it, if I remember correctly. It's quite high, yeah. There were some people who were not working at the time, I think, 10%, but had been working before, like within 2 or 3 years ago or something. So then we asked them, well, back then when you were working 2 or 3 years ago, how much was your wage? So we use that for the people who aren't working now. Okay, yeah, keep asking questions. Now let's talk about some gender differences. First of all, there's not much difference between how old they are and the parents' education. There is some differences in wealth, and there's two possible things going on there. One is that at the time these kids were very young in rural China, if a couple had a girl, they were allowed to have a second child. But if the couple had a boy, they were not. Okay, so basically, girls tend to live in larger families than boys. So in per capita terms, the wealth goes down. And there may also be something going on with sex-selective abortion too. We haven't really looked at it, but it may be that wealthier families have more access to that or something. But these are not the really interesting ones. Okay, so then if you look at the sort of educational outcomes here, for several of these, for the cognitive ones, the girls actually have lower scores than the boys. By the way, all these cognitive, non-cognitive skills, we've normalized them to have a mean of about 0 and a standard deviation of 1. Okay, you can see that the standard deviation is very close to 1. Okay, so it turns out that for these sort of general knowledge tests that we're going to focus on a lot because they have more power than the academic tests, that the boys did better than the girls. But actually, it's not shown on the slide, but for the literacy test for 2009, there was no difference. The girls had sort of caught up to the boys. Not really sure what's going on there. For the internalizing, externalizing, there wasn't much difference in 2000. But there was a difference in externalizing in 2004. These are when the kids are 13 to 16. You don't think of them as like teenagers, in puberty or whatever. And the boys had a much higher externalizing. They were just behaving more badly than girls were.
So for this kind of psychological people, is it designed in a way that is sex neutral? Sex neutral. The design of the measurement is a testing. So it's just maybe boys and girls are different, responding to different questions. So I mean,
yeah, so maybe it's not their actual behavior, but it's just how they respond to the questions. Yeah, I don't know that we can really tease that out. That's a good point. Actually, the way we can, and I think we saw this with when we asked their teachers and we asked their parents, I think we still see the same differences, but I need to double check if that's.
I'm sure Professor Fung and Wang Hong can tell you, but when we do these tests now with similar data in the late 2010s, the girls are better than the boys. So,
even at.
So you're saying that they were worse than the boys here, and then they're equal in 2009 by the end end of the 2010s, they're doing better than the boys.
Yeah,
almost summarily.
So they're like in their late teens by that time or something?
No, this is 10 year, this is 8 to 10 year olds.
But
yeah.
Even, I mean,
so I don't know if it's,
there's some social norm in China, at least I know that.
So
boys and girls behave differently, right?
Okay, yeah.
So for same environment, they must be different between two sexes, actually. So if they are the same, they'll be strange to me. So
yeah, okay, yeah. So anyways, that's what we're seeing. I mean, we didn't see it for these internalizing, externalizing. We didn't see much difference in 2000, but by 2004, when they're teenagers, we see it, especially for the externalizing. Some differences. And the other thing we have, you can think of it as a non-cognitive educational aspirations. We just ask them a question: do you want to go to college? Or maybe we just say, what's the highest level of education you want? And if they say university or college, then this is just a dummy variable. And there wasn't much. Let me think. Oh, there was a difference. The boys were more at higher aspirations than the girls. when they were 9 to 12 years old, but when they're 13 to 14, the difference is pretty much gone. So I'm not really sure what's going on there, but that's something we look at. Okay, so here's some other gender differences. When they're adults, the girls have a little bit less years of schooling. They're less likely to be in the labor force. Their income, if you look at like log hourly wage, it's really quite a bit lower. Like, I mean, this is, since it's in log, it's like a 27% lower hourly wage. And they're a little bit less likely to migrate out of Gansu province into, you know, more advanced, so-called advanced provinces, more likely to be married. That's just because I think in China and many other countries, the age of marriage is a little bit higher for boys than for girls, or men for women. So we're kind of looking at kids who are the same age. So girls or women are more likely to be married, and they're more likely to have a child. And also because they're not, them are not working, they're more likely to be missing wage labor. Okay, so we'll keep going here. So the empirical strategy is not very sophisticated, except for some sample selection things we did. We just sort of say, okay, here's wages, you know, what determines wages. But actually, there's also we do years of schooling, then we go to log hourly wages. And so we just look at, you know, a bunch of control variables, parental education, and gender dummy, and you know, wealth per capita, and stuff like an interview type. Some of these kids were interviewed in person, some were interviewed on the phone, and for some of them, for some questions, we just asked their parents or somebody else we could find some questions about them. And then we're focusing on the cognitive and the non-cognitive skills. Okay, we have village fixed effects. If I remember correctly, there's 100 villages, 20 kids originally from each village. And this is kind of a standard, you know, Minster style wage regression, except, and we're gonna have some, when we do wages, some of the specifications are gonna have years of schooling controlled for, and other ones don't. It turns out it doesn't make as much difference as you might think, but we'll see that in a minute. Okay, but nothing very fancy about that. But there's, you know, when you run a really simple regression like that, there's lots of potential problems. Reverse causality, if we just had cross-sectional data, you might say, okay, the kids who are, you know, having externalizing behavior have lower wages. Is that because they first had the externalizing behavior and their wages went down, or they just were unlucky and got a bad paying job and then they started acting, you know, badly and misbehaving? But we're gonna get cognitive non-cognitive skills measured when they were in school, when they weren't working. So that kind of takes care of that. A bigger problem, I think, is measurement error. And some things we do, this may be completely obscure to you, but this is basically when we do the non-cognitive skills, you know, they often answer in what you call, you know, a Likert scale, where they say, you know, no, never do that, or not very often, or often, or very often. So there's something, for those of you who are familiar with heading response theory, that's used a lot on tests to like get a better measure of skills. There's something similar that you can use called a graded response model, which works for these sort of scales. Okay, but other things we do to deal with that is there's some instrumental variables estimates where we take the parents or the teachers' answers to similar questions, and you know, sometimes we use one measure of cognitive skill as an instrument for the others, like, you know, how well you did on that general literacy test. We can use the Chinese, more academic Chinese test as an instrument variable. Okay, and then there's kind of a tricky thing about correlation between cognitive and non-cognitive skills. You know, we find some effect. Well, let's put it this way. You know, it may be that your cognitive skills will affect your non-cognitive skills, or vice versa. Okay, so if you put them both in the same regression, I mean, suppose we think that non-cognitive skills can affect your cognitive skills, then if we put them both in the regression, we're maybe underestimating a little bit of the effect of the non-cognitive skills, because part of it is working through the cognitive skills. Okay, so if you put them both in, maybe you're underestimating a little bit what happens. So sometimes we run some regressions. This is mostly in the appendix of the paper, where we just put in one and not the other, which will probably overestimate the effect. But then we say, okay, But if you put them both in, we're probably underestimating. If you put one and not the other, you're probably overestimating. So it gives us some kind of balance. And then there's omitted variable bias. And I think in some ways, I'm thinking more of this as measurement error bias, where OLS will be attenuation bias, and so you'll maybe underestimate. Okay. So we don't perfectly deal with all these things, but we do the best we have. But we have a pretty nice data set. We can try this. Yes.
So how do you handle the potential bias from the attrition of students?
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna get to the attrition in just a minute. Okay, yeah, thanks.
It's just for curiosity.
Yeah.
So between the two scales, which one is more nature, which one is more nurture? We don't know.
We really haven't tried to think about that. I mean,
Which one comes first?
Yeah. Well,
We don't know that.
if I knew that, I'd probably be a psychology professor or something. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, my gut feeling is that non-cognitive skills are really affected a lot by your upbringing and so forth, whereas cognitive may be more nature, like genetic inheritance or something. But I could be wrong. I don't know.
Do you recall the correlation coefficient between the cognitive and non-cognitive?
Yeah, I think we actually have a slide on that. Let me just jump ahead. This is in our the appendix. Oops, no. Okay, this is a lot of things we did. Okay, maybe we didn't have a slide. Oh, here we go. Yeah, these are the correlations. They're not very correlated, actually. So this is correlations over time in the non-cognitive skills, okay? And this is actually kind of breaking them down into some, this was the, okay, let's see. Oh, this is like yeah, we measured in 2015, the big five, for those who are familiar with this, and depression. So these are these, and they weren't heavily correlated with these. And we also, I don't know if we have another correlation slide in here. No, I don't think so. We do find that the non-cognitive skills are not heavily correlated, like when they're 9 and 12, and then when they're 13 and 16. In fact, I think if I recall correctly, we find the correlation between the 2000 and the 2009 wave to be larger than the correlation between the 2009, 2000, and 2004 and 2004. And we think that 2004 they were going through being a teenager, and they're all kind of like there's a lot of noise there. So. But they're not heavily correlated, cognitive and non-cognitive over time. They are more correlated.
But if they're not stable, why do we call it scales?
Yeah, I mean, it's true that I would say there's a lot of noise in these things. Okay.
Paul, do you want me to show the correlation table? I think it's not in the slides, but I have it on my laptop if you want to show that table.
Yeah,
but it's probably
possible.
like what you're describing.
Okay, I guess I'm getting a look that maybe this will mess up our.
So what does it show, Yang?
It's basically what Paul was describing, that the cognitive skills are, the autocorrelation across waves are quite high. So you could maybe think of that as a better measurement of a skill. And the internalizing and externalizing behavior are not super correlated with one another across waves. So like 2000 and 2004, they're not highly correlated with one another. However, I think this is kind of getting into our results a little bit. So what you see on the screen here is that 2004, when the kids are in their puberty, in their teenage kind of years, those internalizing and externalizing behavior are much more strongly correlated with their adult big five. So that's what you're seeing. You're seeing like their adulthood big five personality. How does their childhood internalizing and externalizing behavior predict their adulthood personality? And it seems like the puberty age kind of non-cognitive measures are stronger predictors. which is also what we saw in our, later on, you will see in the results, it's the puberty internalizing and externalizing where we see most of the actions.
And Yang, if I recall correctly, the non-cognitive and cognitive were not highly correlated, right, with each other.
Right, and that's also what other people have found from other data sources, like Heckman et al. 2006, and another data from Netherlands. The correlation between cognitive and non-cognitive are pretty low, like 0.1 or something like that.
Okay. All right. Okay, yeah, well, we're not going to share this slide because
We can try, we've just never done it before.
run their own direction here.
Last papers.
Okay, now this is right. I don't know that. Sometimes PowerPoint, there's more slides in there. than real. Oops.
Sometimes for fewer.
Okay. All right.
That's it.
The clickers are much more powerful. Okay. All right, I'm gonna go slow, very slowly. Back to where I was. Okay, yeah, so somebody asked a question about, what about sample attrition? So that's kind of the next step here. Okay, so basically there's sort of two kinds of sample attrition. One is that we just lose kids over time, you know, we lost track of them. And the second one is that even if we don't lose track of them, not all of them are working, especially for the women. Okay, so we kind of estimate a bivariate, you would call it a probit, but it's semi-parametric, where one thing is just, we lose you completely, sample attrition. And then for those who we do find, you know, then we still be missing the wage for some people, okay? And if you're familiar with this literature going back to Heckman's paper, like in 1979, it's a very good idea to have some variable in your selection equation that is not in your wage equation. So what we did for sample attrition, we think that this is a very clever thing, but you can see what you think, is that we used the last name of the kid, okay? Why is that? Well, for those who are familiar with China, there aren't a huge number of last names, you know? So you can go to some place and you can find, you know, people with the same name or the same last name. So what we did is in each of the villages that we went in, each of the counties, I think, we went in, we had this separate data set which said how common are the last names in this county. And then we created a variable, which is like, for your last name, how many people in your county have that last name? Okay, and it turned out to have very high predictive power for losing the kid in the sample. Like if your name is Lee, you know, a very common last name, yeah, we're more likely to lose you. But I think Zoe, or my co-author, if I'm not mistaken, that's a much less common name. It'd be easier to find him. Okay, so that's how we, the main thing. We also had a couple of other things like parental wealth, you know, like if your parents are wealthy, probably it's easier for you to migrate out of the province, you know, and so that was another one we used there. And then for missing wages, our main thing was being female and also having a child. That has a big effect on women not working if they have a child, a young child, okay? So that's kind of what we did. And so if you want to see all the details of how this works, so the first one is, you know, whether you're in the sample or not. And then if you are in the sample, in other words, y1 is equal to 1, then we figure out whether you are actually in the, you know, we had a wage for you. That's y2 is whether we have a wage for you. And so then we jointly estimate these two binary outcomes here. This is the likelihood function, but the important thing I think is those the exclusion restrictions, the variables that predict, and you find actually that it really works well. So for the overall thing of just being in the sample, okay, yeah, the last name actually has pretty good predictive power, okay? Well, in other words, if you have a popular last name, we're more likely to lose you from the sample. And then when we focus on jointly estimating these two things, and we say, well, are you missing a wage conditional on still being in the sample? We find that, missing a wage, if you're married, and especially if you're a woman who has a child, you're much more likely to be missing the wage. Okay, so that's kind of our method of dealing with, sample selection, potential sample selection bias. It turned out that these selection correction terms, when we put them into the wage equations, they don't really do much. Okay, so we did a lot of work for not much of a payoff, but we checked it. Okay. All right, so now we're going to go to the results. I got 10 minutes before I'm going to open up to questions. So the first one is just how far do kids go in school? Okay, and so we have two versions, whether or not we control for the sample selection or not. As you can see in this thing, it didn't make much difference. But yeah, if you're at young ages, you do well on the cognitive tests when you're 9 to 12 years old, or the literacy tests when you're 13 to 16, you're much more likely to farther in school. The math and Chinese tests didn't really have as big effects, but the Chinese in 2000 were academic tests, and the more academic math tests in 2004 also had significant explanatory power. So yes, you would expect, kids who were good students back when they were in school, go much farther in school. Okay, so that's not a big surprise. What about non-cognitive skills? Well, to make a long story short, the only thing that really seemed to matter was aspirations when they were 13 to 16 years old. None of the other stuff had a big effect. Okay. Now, in externalizing, when you're a teenager, it was negative, as you would expect. If you're kind of a misbehaving kid, you may not go as far in school, but it's not statistically significant. Okay. And the results are not very different whether we control for sample selection or not. Okay. But now, maybe the more interesting thing is to look at wages. Okay. So here we got 4 regressions. First of all, we adjust, or in columns 3 and 4, do not adjust for sample selection. It made a little bit of a difference, but not a lot. And then we also, put in years of schooling or leave it out, and years of experience. In the paper that was published in 2017 with Albert Park and Xiaocheng Huang, we found that when we put in the years of schooling, the cognitive tests were no longer significant. Okay, so we didn't really find much. But here, we get a very different result. Well, first of all, if we don't put in years of schooling, then we get that these sort of more practical tests, the adult literacy test that was taken when they're teenagers, and the cognitive test when they're 9 to 12, so very high explanatory power. The actual more academic tests didn't, after we conditioned on that, had no explanatory power, which is a little surprising. I would have thought that these would have some explanatory power. But the other thing that was even more surprising, given the previous paper, is that even when we put in years of schooling, years of experience, the coefficients go down a little bit, but they're still highly significant, which basically means that the wages people get, even conditioning on their years of schooling, depend a lot on these cognitive skills. Okay.
But I think it can still be important if you test them jointly.
Oh, these down here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't recall. I mean, Yang, did we ever test jointly whether the math and Chinese tests were jointly significant?
I don't recall.
These are highly correlated measures.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we can check that though. Of course, it's easy to say we can check that when the paper was published last year. Reduces your motivation, but
I think when we did the bounding test, meaning when we only include the cognitive variables, so like only these variables and not including any of the non-cognitive variables, then the Chinese and math test scores become significant.
oh, okay. Thanks.
Are there non-cognitive?
Yeah, they're going to come. That's the next slide. The
But
non-cognitive.
are they in?
Yeah, they're in here. They are in here.
Oh, they are.
So yeah, we could fit it all on one slide. Okay, so the next thing is the non-cognitive. And here, we don't find much happening on average, but we're going to see later that if we divide by male and female, there is going to be some effects. I mean, we do see, for example, for externalizing, negative effects. But, you know, the T statistics are roughly around 1 or something, so they're not significant. The ones for 2000 are very small, the coefficients. We're not seeing much going on. There seems to be more going on with the 2004. And you see, as we saw before, that the wages, you know, being a woman, the wages are much lower. Okay. So if you just stop here, you think, okay, I guess the non-cognitive doesn't really matter for wages. Okay. Do you remember, Young, did we do anything where we, you know, joint tests for all the non-cognitive skills together? And I don't recall that it was significant, but I don't remember.
I don't remember. I would have to go back and check. I don't think I don't think we did the joint test.
Okay, well, something else we
But
should.
this comes back to Hong Bin's question, doesn't it, that if these aren't stable, if you don't see these effects in
Right.
adults, why would you necessarily expect them to show up, these early measures in their subsequent age?
Yeah, well, we'll see later on that we are going to see some significant differences for men and women. So maybe that's what we need to go to next. Okay, so before we do that though, in the earlier paper with Albert Park and Cho-Chung Huang, we didn't really find much effect even of the cognitive skills. And part of the reason is that, or you might think part of the reason is we had a smaller sample size, because only about 40% of the people were working, but in fact the point estimates are very different. Okay. And you might also think, well, maybe you know, it only matters for people who are in college, and before we didn't have anybody finish college, but that really doesn't matter at all. What we think really is going on is that these kids have now been working for a few years, and you know, when you first get a job, the employer just sort of sees. Maybe that's the next slide. Yeah, when you first get a job, the employer just sees your years of education, kind of decides how much you to pay that, but then over time they see like if you're really how good you are for this one, your years of schooling, and so they do that. We did some stuff to kind of check that. We found, for example, that people who change jobs or change occupations, the explanatory power of the cognitive skills increased a lot. In other words, you know, if your employer is not paying you and you're a better than average employee given your education, you're going to get a different job. Or maybe there's just takes some time for matching, a good match of an employer to an employee. And when the earlier paper, there wasn't much time to do much matching, but now there's been 4 more years went by, or actually more like 6 or 7 more years went by, and then you know, we think that maybe, you know, there was time to identify these non-cognitive skills, and also time to for people to kind of move around and switch jobs that really, you know, were the ones that were appropriate for their skills. Okay.
But it seems, I mean, we did some work in some factories, and they didn't want to hire people with high cognitive skills. Okay, because it's the jobs are so menial, and that's who's in your sample with Albert Park, is they're just the junior high dropouts or the vocational school, which didn't have anything.
That's true.
And so they're all just dumped into the factories, and you know, our first suggestion to the employer was ask them if they've ever been to high school or not, and if they've been to high school, don't hire them. And they wouldn't argue much, and they would leave. The turnover went down, but then everybody, of course, figured this out, and then everybody did mark that they'd never been to high school before. So then they actually started giving them cognitive tests, and anybody that scored higher on the cognitive test, they didn't hire, because they didn't. But once you get these college grads or
even high school grads
or Pugao, the academic high school grads that then you know have better cognitive skills that then get matched. I mean, do you think that's what?
That's possible. Yeah, there's probably something we could have checked about that. I mean, in the earlier paper, the ones who were working were the ones who didn't finish high school, so they could have been ones, you know, and their cognitive skills, yeah, the ones who didn't finish high school have lower cognitive skills, so. And so there probably was less variation, yeah, that's I think an interesting point. Okay. But really what we want to do, this is just some other, this just shows you that the ones who change their occupation, sorry you really can't see, the ones who change their occupation, you see these big payoffs to cognitive tests. If they didn't change their occupation, nothing happens, or if they change the employer. That's just the details of what I was just showing you. We looked at other outcomes, again, sorry for these small things, but yeah, the cognitive tests, there's some, predictive power, less likely to have a child, more likely to be in an urban area, more likely to have a high paying occupation, stuff like that. So that's kind of consistent with the other things I would show you, but let's get to the gender differences. Okay. So on average, these non-cognitive skills weren't doing anything. But if we allow for variation between men and women, so we put in these interaction terms, both for cognitive and for non-cognitive skills, then we start to see, actually for this one, this is years of schooling, we don't see a lot going on. It doesn't really make a big difference. There are a few things that are significant a little bit, like internalizing behavior. If it's measured in 2004, the internalizing behavior, for girls that had a somewhat negative effect, but only significant at the 10% level. But then if we look at wages, we see some pretty big differences here. Okay. And so basically what's going on here, these are basically these are the effects on men, and then is there a difference for women? And what you see in here is that actually, we zoom it in the next slide, you can probably really see it, okay? So what we see going on here for the interaction terms is that for internalizing behavior, which is more like being a quiet, maybe not very extroverted person, for women that actually pays off a bit, okay? But if you're more externalizing, if you're more sort of aggressive and so forth, for women, that's a big negative effect, okay? And I think people found these things like in the US, if I remember correctly, Marianne Bertrand and some other people found that women maybe don't compete. I actually know I think I got it.
So, the two variables, I mean, they add up to one, internalizing, externalizing.
Now adding up to one, you mean the internalizing?
Yeah, obviously each other, right? So the two variables. So it's one is big, one is small, something like that, right?
Well, they're mentioning two different kinds of things.
Different things.
Yeah, there's like two separate variables. It's not like, one is equal to one minus the other one or something like that.
What's the correlation between the two?
The correlation?
Zero?
It wasn't very high, but again, there was kind of a noisy variable, I think, I think it's probably the correlation that would be negative, that people who are withdrawn are less likely to make trouble.
So internalizing basically 5%, externalizing means talk a lot.
Yeah, I mean the opposite of being internalizing. Sure, why am I showing it on the screen like that? The opposite of being internalizing is being more extroverted. You can be extroverted but not be externalizing. You can be extroverted without getting in fights with people and stuff like this, and running away from home or something like that. So they're not really the same thing. It's that the one is not the name is kind of misleading because internalizing is not the opposite of external.
Okay. So how do I interpret the education aspirations conditional upon how much education they actually got? What does aspirations mean?
Yeah, I guess they're just were more ambitious. When they were asked about in 2004, when they were 13 to 16, they were more likely to say, yeah, I want to go beyond high school. I want to go to university. And so we're controlling for what actually happened. So I would interpret this as being more ambitious women actually do get higher wages, controlling for all this other stuff. And I think later on we find that, Well, we'll see, but I think they're also less likely to have children and be married and stuff.
Yeah, that was in that
Yeah.
one. We have about
Oh.
15, 12
Actually,
minutes.
we're almost done.
Keep
We're almost done.
going and then we'll,
Okay,
yeah,
yeah.
why don't you take 5 minutes to.
Okay, okay. Yeah, so this slide is really the punchline in terms of, differences between men and women. And we especially kind of focus on the externalizing one, that for women to be aggressive, and maybe too aggressive, in some senses, they get penalized for that. But for men, they don't. Okay. In fact, I think if we go back, for 2004, the externalizing, this is really for men, is actually positive. Like being an aggressive man it's not significant, but being an aggressive man may actually pay off a little bit in terms of your wages, but not for women.
And shy is negative.
Yeah, and for a shy man, that's up here, that's not good. Okay. So any shy men here, sorry. Sorry about that. But I could be a shy man.
We're economists, none of us here.
Okay. Okay, this is something, just kind of a side point, which is that we divided up the women into those whose village had more equalizing gender norms, and those were like less equalizing gender norms. And it seems that the big effect is for women who come from a village where they have more equalized gender norms. In other words, they probably grew up thinking, hey, it's okay to be ambitious or whatever, or aggressive. And then when they go to the labor market, they get whacked, okay, for being like that. All right, other outcomes, again, sorry, it's very small, but let's look at that, educational aspirations. Yeah, the ones who had, conditional on having schooling, they get higher occupations. They're less likely to be married and have kids, but it's not significant, especially for having kids. Okay, so now let me just kind of wrap it up. So we found that, the cognitive skills is very high explanatory powers after you wait a few more years to see what it is. Explanatory power for both years of education and for wages, even after conditioning on wages, experience, and other things. So maybe what's going on, it just takes a while for people to kind of find the right job that really uses their cognitive skills. And finally, we have these gender differences, especially for non-cognitive skills, that seem to contribute, could be contributing to the gender wage gap. Okay. But there's other things we can do, like why is it, what determines this cognitive and non-cognitive skills? Obviously people like me and Eric, Rick, look at these, what determines how much kids learn in school. We've learned a lot, there's a lot more to learn. And in non-cognitive skills, that's even more, less developed, I think. Okay, I think that's it. Everything else is like extra tables. So thanks for all your questions, but we have more time for questions.
Open for questions.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm interested to know how your cognitive skills results compare to the norm. Like Scott's, ECD in rural China shows that 28% of the rural children are cognitive delayed. And in one of my papers shows that when it's normal IQ, meaning non-low IQ students, then their non-cognitive skills matters. But for the kids who are cognitive delayed with low IQ, no matter how external, internal, or grit they are, it doesn't change their test scores. So I wonder if the same kind of underlying condition.
Yeah, we haven't really looked at that.
So the interaction.
Yeah, just interacting with cognitive and non-cognitive. So you're saying that if you have low cognitive skills, then your non-cognitive doesn't really matter very much. And is that in terms of wages or in terms of
their test scores?
The test scores. Okay. Yeah, we haven't really thought about that much, but we could interact. By the way, this data is pretty much available. If anybody wants to use it, they can get it. I'm not sure if Young and maybe Young didn't want me to say that, but I'm going to do some more stuff on it. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff in here that you could do, things like that. Yes.
I was just curious to know, in terms of where these children go when they start earning wages and stuff like that. I'm assuming there are factory jobs, especially for the women. I think some of the sociological literature about people here, you need different kinds of non-cognitive skills for different kinds of fields that you're in. Should I just assume that where they go is pretty much factory jobs and stuff like that?
Let me ask Young, do you recall like the kind of jobs they went to? The service sector is pretty big. The factory is also. Do we have a breakdown of
2015, right?
Yeah. I don't think it was in the slides.
I mean, lots of the women are gonna go to nannies, hotel jobs, restaurant waitresses, which you don't wanna have really externalizing. No, you could see that would be why they would lose their job.
Yeah, they like lose their temper with the client.
With the baby.
Young, do you know, you have a,
So there are a lot of them go into manufacturing and construction, and but there's a lot of women who go into sales and service and public sector jobs, so like teachers or other kind of government employee kind of jobs too. So women are more likely to go into the public sector and service and sales, and men are much more likely to go into construction and manufacturing and transportation.
Okay.
Is this something that you're gonna follow up on? I ask this because if you look in developed countries, not developing, in developed countries, the returns to cognitive skills are lower throughout the age 20s. But when you get to be 35 to 55, they're stable and a lot higher than they were early. And you have an early sample here.
Right.
And I don't know any evidence on developing countries, but it is an issue.
Yeah, we should do that. Talk to Albert. Albert Park is the guy who's really like keeping the tracks of this. He's now the chief economist of the Asian Development Bank. So
use your money, Albert.
Yeah. So he's got a lot of money.
Anybody want to help?
I'm sure
Emily. I'm sure Emily would welcome you too.
I'm just a dean, right? It's just a dean.
Yeah. A dean and a dean and a lead economist.
Yeah. No, that's a good idea. So you're saying that was it the cognitive or the
why is what's the intuition on that?
The intuition is that they both employers learn, there's employer learning, but there's also individuals sorting out through jobs where they get paid off, and over time, I mean, it's the same as
maybe you learn over time too.
But it's also the same story as with vocational education, where it's there's a payoff early in life, but as things change, as the world changes, those returns go down.
And were they measuring those cognitive skills at the same time at age 30, or were they using measures from when they were
No,
kids?
they're using the contemporaneous measures in this. And so it's from the OECD PIOC sample, and you have a random sample throughout the entire earnings distribution or age distribution, and you give them cognitive tests along with finding out labor market and school.
Okay, thanks, So we should talk to Albert about
it. Do you know if they give Ravens tests over time to 15, 25, 35, 45-year-old person? No, you don't know.
No,
is it the same?
Nobody in developed countries gives Ravens. That's a developing country business.
Marcel?
Yes, it's so assertiveness seems to be penalized for women. And I remember a paper by journalists and co-authors that assertiveness increases in women after menopause. That's got to do with the balance of estrogen and testosterone in the body. So I was wondering whether you would also observe that women who become more assertive as a result of menopause face a penalty in terms of work.
Well, we'd have to wait a while. I don't think they're old enough.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
But maybe in other data.
That means that, but that feeds into this issue of
That's
whether
interesting.
they learn that being assertive is penalized, and so by then they
Uh-huh.
won't have to have learned. So that would be the test for the learning aspect of this.
Yeah.
I think labor participation of women who are in menopause in China, if you did it even today, it's probably 10%. So it's
But maybe for
more or less. Right. Urban it's higher, so it's
do we know, has anybody ever looked at that?
Not that I know of.
Okay, any more questions? Yeah.
I'm wondering for the male neighbors, because they, as she said, they most of them work in the factory or in the construction, those kind of neighbors. Did the paper control their physical situation, I mean, yeah, that's really demand their labor force, so maybe some of the
Yeah,
their
we-
motor
It's a very,
skills,
very-
motor skills.
Yeah, we did measure, I mean, in terms of like height and weight when they were
Right,
13, 16, I think maybe when they're 9 through 12. So we know like their physical size.
Yeah.
I don't think we measured anything more like motor skills or grip tests or anything like this.
We did have in some specification their overall health measure, and we include them in the controls, and it doesn't seem to affect any of our main results. If that's what you're thinking about, like how their health correlates with their skills and then affects the wages.
Were you thinking of maybe the men were stronger and that's
Yeah.
why they go into construction and manufacturing?
Right, these stronger men always earn more than
Yeah.
those tiny one or
Yeah.
those very weak. Or
Yeah, I mean, we could certainly check in terms of, are they taller and heavier, whether they are more likely to end up in those construction or manufacturing. We haven't really done that. I don't think we've done that, have we?
You mean checking whether men are taller than women, or whether?
Or whether the tall men are more likely to go into construction or manufacturing than the short men.
I haven't. No, we haven't checked.
We never did that. We never looked at that. But again, this is something somebody should. Yeah.
Currently a lot of papers focusing on non-cognitive outcome, and they explain their labor outcome focusing on social interaction.
Mhm.
Yeah, and for the gender difference, a lot of paper they show men and female they more perform difference because they are work under pressure or they're less competition on these areas. So I'm wondering, for this paper, we use cognitive outcome or non-cognitive outcomes. Still, our measurement can have anything deep understanding on these two parts. Since I look at the measurement we have used, but I didn't find very very deep thinking for how to explain. During their labor market, how they're under pressure or anything characteristic that we use.
Yeah.
And the second question about the female labor participation, mostly we will estimate after the 32. It will have the female who can totally participate the work. Since before that age, there may give children or anything else. That is 2.
Okay, yeah, the first question, we don't have any, we don't have much information about directly asking for the jobs, whether this job is high pressure jobs or something like that, or this job, but I think we could get that indirectly by looking at the occupation type. I think there are certain occupations that are more high pressure and other ones, or that require more interactions, like somebody was saying, you know, if you work in the, you know, in a restaurant or hotel, you have to like interact with people.
So we can divide it all their occupation, their user cognitive skill or non-cognitive skill.
Right.
And use the occupation net, something like.
Oh,
like
yes,
right. To
yeah.
a deep understanding which kind of characteristic we'll talk.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah, try that. And your second question, can you repeat it again? It was about the gender, something about.
Yeah, for female, they may want to give children their will participation in the labor market very delayed. So if we want to compare the gender difference in wage, so there will be a really long time data to able to have us to all of their.
Right, so wait until women are older and their kids are in school and they can go back to work and then look at the differences.
Okay.
Yeah, that, I think, you know, and if we go back and collect more data, we can look at those kinds of things. Yeah, certainly, I mean, there's two parts. There's like, are you working or how many hours you're working? And then conditional on, you know, working, what is your hourly wage, you know? And so we might see labor force participation going up when the kids are older, but I'm not sure what's going to happen to the hourly wage, whether it will catch up a little bit with the male.
But just collecting older data doesn't solve this problem if in fact it's a matter of experience, because you look at age 35 and some women don't have much experience, and others do, and so that doesn't solve that problem.
Yeah, that's true. That complicates stuff.
Okay, why don't we thank Paul and John